At 23:40 hours on December 29, 1944, Major Carroll C. Smith settled into the cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow at McGuire Field, Mindoro, his eyes fixed on the radar scope as his operator tracked contacts materializing through pitch-black skies 40 miles north of the Philippine Islands. Smith was 26 years old with 43 combat missions behind him and 4 confirmed kills to his name. 12 Japanese bombers were inbound that night, their mission simple: destroy the American airfields before they became operational. Smith understood the stakes perfectly. For 14 consecutive days, Japanese aircraft had hammered Mindoro after dark. 334 separate air raid alerts in 2 weeks. American construction crews were racing to complete 2 airfields that would support the upcoming Lingayen Gulf invasion. Those airfields represented everything. Once operational, American fighters could provide continuous air cover for the invasion fleet. The Japanese High Command recognized this threat immediately. If those airfields went operational, Japanese air power over Luzon would be neutralized. They had to stop construction. The bombing raids came nightly. Betty bombers, Helen bombers, kamikaze aircraft, anything capable of delivering explosives to the target. Smith's squadron, the 418th Night Fighter Squadron, had touched down at Mindoro just 3 days earlier on December 26th. His unit now stood as the sole aerial defense for 20,000 American troops bivouacked in tents across the island. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on Smith's shoulders like physical force. Every Japanese bomber that penetrated his defense meant dead Americans. Construction engineers incinerated in their sleep, entire work crews obliterated by bomb strikes, delayed airfields, a delayed invasion, more casualties at Lingayen Gulf when the landings finally came. The P-61 Black Widow represented technology the Japanese couldn't match. Northrop had designed the Black Widow from the ground up specifically for night interception. The specifications were impressive: 66-foot wingspan, twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engines producing 2,000 horsepower each, maximum speed of 366 bph. The aircraft bristled with 4 20mm Hispano M2 cannons mounted in a ventral turret. But the Black Widow's true weapon wasn't its guns. The SCR-720 airborne intercept radar mounted in the nose could detect aircraft at 5 miles range in absolute darkness. Japanese bomber crews had no equivalent technology, no electronic warning systems, no way to detect a pursuer approaching from behind. They flew night missions operating under a fundamental assumption: darkness provided protection. That assumption was about to kill them. Behind Smith in the Black Widow's radar compartment sat Lieutenant Philip Porter. Porter had been tracking contacts on radar scopes for 6 months. He knew how to interpret the glowing returns on his cathode ray tubes, how to vector Smith onto enemy aircraft, how to distinguish between friendly transports and hostile bombers. The radar system worked because Porter possessed exceptional skill. Night interception demanded absolute coordination between pilot and radar operator. They functioned as a single organism. Any breakdown in that coordination meant mission failure. The tactical problem tonight was straightforward but brutal. 1 P-61, 12 Japanese bombers. If Smith engaged a single target, 11 others would slip past to bomb the airfields. The mathematics were unforgiving. Even if Smith achieved 3 or 4 kills, the remaining bombers would complete their mission. American casualties would mount. Construction would halt. The airfields would be damaged. The invasion timetable would slip by days or weeks. Smith had trained extensively for night interception. 18 months of specialized instruction at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida. Radar navigation procedures, instrument flight in total darkness, gunnery practice against invisible targets. The training was exhaustive because night combat represented the most dangerous form of aerial warfare. No visual horizon, no ground references, just instrument readings, radar returns, and absolute faith that your equipment functioned correctly and your radar operator knew his job. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had entered combat in November 1943, initially flying missions from primitive New Guinea airstrips. The squadron started with P-70 Havocs, then transitioned to modified P-38 Lightnings equipped with experimental radar systems. Those early radar sets rarely functioned properly. The P-61s arrived in September 1944 and changed everything. The Black Widow was stable in flight, forgiving of pilot errors, and powerful enough to catch any Japanese bomber. Most critically, the radar actually worked as designed. But even perfect radar couldn't alter tonight's mathematics. 12 bombers approaching. Smith's fuel load would sustain approximately 3 hours of flight operations. If he spent 10 minutes prosecuting each intercept, he could engage perhaps 3 targets before fuel constraints forced him back to base. 9 bombers would reach their targets unopposed. 9 bombers carried enough ordnance to destroy fuel dumps, ammunition stockpiles, kill hundreds of Americans, and set back the invasion schedule by weeks. If you want to see how Smith managed to intercept 4 Japanese bombers in 80 minutes of flying time, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Smith. Porter's voice crackled through the intercom at 2342. 4 separate contacts on scope, all tracking south toward Mindoro, all at different altitudes. Smith faced immediate decisions. Which bomber to pursue first? Whether his plan to intercept all 4 targets represented tactical brilliance or suicidal overconfidence. Smith advanced both throttles. The twin R-2800 engines responded with immediate power. The Black Widow climbed at 2,000 feet per minute. Porter began calling vectors. Heading Euro 35, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. Smith peered through the canopy glass and saw nothing. Pure blackness. No moon visible, no stars. Heavy cloud cover obscured everything below. This was precisely why Japanese planners had selected tonight for the raid. Total darkness rendered conventional American fighters useless. P-38 Lightning pilots and P-47 Thunderbolt pilots needed moonlight or searchlight illumination to visually acquire targets. Without light, they were blind. But the P-61 didn't require light. The radar made darkness irrelevant. The SCR-720 radar employed a rotating parabolic antenna dish in the Black Widow's nose section. That dish continuously transmitted microwave pulses forward in a 180-degree arc. When those pulses struck an aircraft, they reflected back to the receiver. Porter's radar scopes displayed those reflections as glowing pips on cathode ray tubes. He monitored 2 separate scopes simultaneously. One displayed azimuth, the target's bearing left or right relative to the aircraft's nose. The second displayed elevation, whether the target flew above or below the Black Widow. Porter watched both screens, translating the electronic data into verbal instructions that guided Smith toward the contact. Left 5 degrees, down 3 degrees. Porter's voice remained calm and precise. The system functioned because Porter never panicked, never rushed his calls, never made errors under pressure. Range 3 miles. Smith activated his own radar display, a smaller scope integrated into the main instrument panel. When targets closed within approximately 5 miles, the pilot could track them independently. Smith's scope was simpler than Porter's dual displays, just one screen showing range and relative bearing. But it sufficed. Once Smith acquired the target on his own scope, he could prosecute the intercept without constant verbal guidance. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M Type 1. American aircrew called them Bettys. The aircraft featured twin Mitsubishi Kasei, 14-cylinder radial engines producing 1,530 horsepower each. Maximum speed, 272 mph at 16,000 feet. Standard crew complement, 7 men. Bomb load capacity, 160 pounds. The Betty suffered from one critical design flaw that transformed it into a flying death trap. no self-sealing fuel tanks. Japanese engineers had sacrificed crew protection for extended range. A single burst of 20mm cannon fire into the wing root fuel cells would ignite the Betty like a torch. Range, 2 miles. Smith could see the target pip on his scope now, steady bearing, constant altitude. The bomber crew remained completely unaware that an American night fighter was closing from astern. Japanese bombers carried no tail warning radar, no electronic warfare equipment, no method of detecting a pursuing aircraft except visual sighting. In total darkness, visual detection was impossible. They flew through the night convinced that darkness protected them. The P-61 Black Widow had made that conviction fatal. Smith reduced the range steadily, 1,000 yards. The Betty remained invisible to naked eye observation. Darkness was absolute. Smith relied entirely on his radar scope. The glowing pip grew brighter as range decreased, 800 yards, 700, 600. At 500 yards, Smith finally acquired visual contact, a dark shape silhouetted against clouds that were marginally less dark. The bomber's exhaust flames were barely visible, faint orange glows from the engine nacelles. Smith maneuvered the P-61 into attack position, slightly below the bomber's altitude, slightly behind it. The four 20mm Hispano M2 cannons were fixed-mounted in the lower fuselage, firing forward along the aircraft's longitudinal axis. Smith had to aim the entire aircraft to aim his guns. He used the N6 optical gun sight integrated into his instrument panel. The gun sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a combining glass mounted at eye level. Smith adjusted aircraft position until the Betty sat centered in that reticle. Range, 400 yards. Smith armed all four cannons. Each gun carried 200 rounds in its ammunition box, 800 rounds total, approximately 40 seconds of continuous fire. But Smith wouldn't need 40 seconds. Night fighter doctrine emphasized short, concentrated bursts, close to lethal range. Fire briefly. Confirm the kill. Move immediately to the next target. Wasting ammunition on one bomber meant fewer rounds available for subsequent targets. Smith pressed the firing trigger at 350 yards. All four 20mm cannons fired simultaneously. The recoil shuddered through the Black Widow's airframe despite the aircraft's substantial mass. High explosive shells streaked toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second. The tracers appeared as red lines drawn across darkness. Smith held the trigger for 2 seconds. 12 rounds per gun, 48 shells total. The Betty's right wing exploded, fuel ignited. Instantly, in a brilliant fireball, the bomber rolled violently right and entered a steep dive. Smith watched it fall. The burning wreckage illuminated clouds below with flickering orange light. The Betty impacted the ocean 8 miles north of Mindoro at 23:57. One bomber destroyed, 11 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed he'd already consumed 15% of his total fuel. 3 more contacts remained on Porter's scope, all still heading toward the airfields, all separated by miles of black sky. And Smith had exactly 112 minutes of fuel remaining. Porter identified the second contact at 0014 on December 30th. Heading 180, altitude 6,000 feet, range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and began descending. The tactical problem was geometric. The second bomber was 23 miles from Smith's current position. The P-61 cruised at 280 psi. Simple calculation, roughly 5 minutes to intercept. But those were 5 minutes the bomber spent flying closer to Mindoro, closer to the airfields, closer to completing its bombing mission. Smith pushed the Black Widow to higher speed, 320 millimeters. The R-2800 engines consumed fuel at alarming rates at high power settings. Every minute at maximum speed cost Smith 3 minutes of patrol endurance. But if he didn't intercept quickly, the bomber would reach the target zone. American anti-aircraft batteries would engage. The bomber might be shot down by ground fire, or it might release its bombs. Either outcome represented Smith's failure. The mathematics of night interception were brutally unforgiving. Most night fighter sorties ended without any radar contact whatsoever. The sky was vast. Even with functioning radar, locating a single bomber required perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. Finding 4 bombers in one night approached statistical impossibility. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had scored 18 total kills since deploying to the Pacific Theater, 18 kills across 14 months of operations. Smith already had 4 kills credited to his name. Adding 4 more in a single night would make him the leading American night fighter ace of the entire war. But personal records were meaningless. What mattered was stopping the bombers. Porter called continuous corrections. Smith adjusted heading in response. The second contact strengthened on the radar scope. Range, 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith acquired visual contact at 1 mile. Another Betty, identical profile, same vulnerable fuel tanks. This bomber was flying lower than the first, 6,000 feet instead of 8,000, closer to the cloud deck. That gave Smith less vertical maneuvering space. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the target. The approach had to be executed perfectly. Too fast, and he'd overshoot the target. Too slow, and the bomber crew might spot him. Night fighters depended absolutely on surprise. Once the enemy knew a night fighter was present, everything changed. Bomber crews would take evasive action. Defensive gunners would open fire. The clean intercept would degenerate into a turning dogfight. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly, dark shape against dark sky. The bomber crew flew straight and level. No evasive maneuvering, no indication they knew Smith's aircraft was there. The P-61's matte black paint scheme made it nearly invisible against the night sky. The engines ran quietly compared to most American fighters. Japanese air crews called the P-61 the Black Widow. They feared it, but fear only functioned if they knew it was coming. Smith centered the target in his gunsight reticle. Range, 350 yards. He fired. 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells tore through the Betty's fuselage. The right engine caught fire immediately. Then the left engine ignited seconds later. Both wings were burning within seconds. The bomber nosed over and dove toward the ocean. Smith watched it fall. Impact occurred at 0019, 17 minutes after midnight. 2 bombers down, 10 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 42% remaining. Porter had 2 more contacts on his radar scope. Both were closer to Mindoro than the previous targets. Both at different altitudes, one at 9,000 feet, one at 4,000 feet, separated by 8 miles. Smith made a tactical decision. He would engage the higher target first. Climbing consumed less fuel than rapid descent, but the higher target was also positioned farther north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to approach closer to the airfields. If Smith made the wrong choice, one bomber would penetrate his defense. The entire mission would be judged a failure. Smith turned north and climbed. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet at 0023. Porter locked onto the third contact. Range 7 miles, heading 160, speed 190 knots. But this bomber was different, faster than the Bettys, taking evasive action, turning, changing altitude. Someone aboard that aircraft knew American night fighters were operating in the area. The third bomber was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu. American crews called them Helens, faster than the Betty, maximum speed, 306 mph. Superior defensive armament, 5 7.7mm machine guns. The tail gunner had clear fields of fire directly aft. Approaching from dead astern would expose Smith to defensive fire. Smith adjusted his attack profile. Instead of positioning directly behind the Helen, he approached from below and to the left, the bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral defensive coverage. The belly was vulnerable. Smith exploited that weakness. Range decreased to 1 mile. The Helen continued evasive maneuvering, turning left, then right, climbing 200 feet, descending 300 feet. The pilot was experienced. He understood that straight and level flight made his aircraft an easy target. Random heading and altitude changes complicated radar tracking significantly. Porter compensated by predicting the bomber's movements. He watched the pattern carefully, anticipated the next maneuver. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's pilot executed a sharp right turn. Smith followed. The P-61's twin-boom configuration provided excellent stability. The aircraft responded smoothly to control inputs. Smith maintained the bomber centered in his gun sight. Range, 500 yards, 450, 400. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streamed past Smith's canopy. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was compromised. Smith had seconds to take his shot before the bomber pilot initiated aggressive evasive maneuvers. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst, 72 rounds, longer than his previous attacks, necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the Helen's fuselage. The right engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled hard right to avoid debris. The burning aircraft fell through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000. It hit the water at 0:29. 29 minutes after midnight, 3 bombers down, 9 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 28%. Critical level approaching. Standard procedure called for returning to base at 30% fuel. Below that threshold, any delay could result in forced landing. Running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant certain death. No visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would impact water before the pilot realized how low he was flying. Porter had one more contact on his scope, the 4th target. Heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude. It was now only 12 miles from Mindoro, close enough that Smith could see searchlight beams from American airfields, thin columns of white light sweeping across the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries stood ready. Gunners had fingers on triggers, waiting for targets to appear. Smith descended toward the 4th bomber. Diving conserved fuel compared to level flight. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. Smith leveled at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage gave him superior attack position. He could dive on the bomber from above, use gravity to increase speed, reduce the time the target had to react. Range, 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith acquired visual contact at 1 mile, another Betty. The bomber was flying directly toward Mindoro. No evasive action. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were active in the area or he didn't care. Perhaps he believed his mission was more important than his survival. Japanese bomber crews frequently accepted death as the necessary price of completing their objectives. Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill, below and behind, 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter, 512 rounds remaining across all 4 guns, enough for perhaps 3 more attacks, maybe 4 if he was very conservative. But this was the 4th target. He needed to ensure the kill. Smith's fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margins. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have sufficient fuel to pursue it again. 1 chance, 1 burst. Then he had to return to base regardless of whether the bomber was destroyed or still flying. Smith fired at 0034, 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The bomber's port wing separated from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread across the remaining wing structure. The Betty rolled left and dove toward the ocean. Impact at 0035, 35 minutes after midnight. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Mindoro. His fuel gauge showed 21%. The mathematical calculation was straightforward. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The Black Widow consumed approximately 100 gallons per hour at cruise power settings. Smith had roughly 60 gallons remaining. At cruise speed, he could fly for another 36 minutes, more than sufficient to reach the airfield, unless something went wrong. Porter scanned his radar scope for additional contacts. Nothing. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they'd detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their nerve was irrelevant. The mission was accomplished. 4 confirmed kills, 0 American casualties. The airfields were safe. Construction crews would work through the night without interruption. The Lingayen Gulf invasion schedule remained intact. But Smith's night wasn't finished. At 0042, Porter detected a new contact. Heading north, range 4 miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. He was 12 miles from McGuire Field, fuel at 19%. The contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was heading directly toward the airfield Smith had just defended. Engaging it would consume more fuel, possibly too much fuel. Smith might not make it back to base. The alternative was worse, letting a Japanese bomber reach Mindoro unchallenged. Smith had destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th bomber penetrated and killed American personnel, the entire night's work would be tainted. Numbers didn't matter if someone died because Smith had prioritized his own survival over mission completion. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called vectors. The range closed rapidly. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Smith acquired visual contact at 800 yards. It wasn't a bomber, it was a Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. The Americans called them Franks, single-engine fighter, maximum speed 392 km. Armament, 4 12.7mm machine guns, 2 20mm cannons, one of the best Japanese fighters in service. The Frank was faster than the P-61, more maneuverable, superior rate of climb. In daylight combat, a skilled Frank pilot could outfight a Black Widow. But this wasn't daylight, and the Frank pilot had no radar. He was flying blind, searching for American aircraft, using visual references that didn't exist in complete darkness. Smith had one decisive advantage. The Frank pilot didn't know Smith was there. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the fighter. Range, 500 yards. The approach was identical to his bomber intercepts. Close distance, fire, confirm the kill. But fighters were smaller targets, harder to hit. And the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and engine. A 2-second burst might not suffice. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel gauge showed 17%. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have time for a second attempt. He would have to disengage immediately and hope he had enough fuel to reach McGuire Field. Missing the shot also meant the Frank would know American night fighters were in the area. The element of surprise would be lost. Future intercepts would become more difficult. Smith centered the Frank in his gun sight. His finger rested on the trigger. The mathematics were clear. Engaging the fighter would drop his fuel to 15%, below minimum safety margin, but letting it go meant risking American lives on the ground. The P-61's engines hummed steadily at 320 miles. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. Smith made his decision at 045. He squeezed the trigger, 3-second burst, 72 rounds, the longest burst of the night. The shells tore through the Frank's tail section and engine cowling. The Frank's engine burst into flames. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled right and dove. Smith watched it descend through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The flames grew larger. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. Smith saw the parachute deploy, a white canopy against black sky. The Frank continued its dive and hit the water at 0046. Smith checked his fuel gauge, 15%. The engagement had consumed more fuel than calculated. McGuire Field was 11 miles south. The P-61's fuel consumption at cruise speed meant Smith had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter guided Smith toward Mindoro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large landmass. McGuire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days. Minimal lighting. No instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps looked like dim, yellow dots, easy to miss in darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%. The P-61's fuel tanks held 646 gallons total. 13% meant 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power settings, that provided 18 minutes of flight time. Smith was 8 miles from the airfield. At 280 mph, that meant approximately 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Enough fuel. Barely. At 052, Smith spotted the runway lights. 12 dim lamps arranged in a line. The runway was 5,000 feet long, crushed coral surface. Engineers had completed construction on December 26th. The same day, the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived. The runway was adequate for P-61 operations, but lacked the safety features of established airfields. No overrun area, no crash barriers. If Smith landed too fast or too slow, the aircraft would leave the runway. At night, with minimal lighting, any landing error would likely prove fatal. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11%, 57 gallons. The P-61 consumed fuel faster during landing approach. Power settings fluctuated. Engines spooled up during turns, spooled down during descents. Each power change consumed additional fuel. Smith calculated he had approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining, more than enough to land, unless something went wrong. At 055, something went wrong. The runway lights went out. All 12 lamps extinguished simultaneously. Complete darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the runway, altitude 800 feet, airspeed 140 knots. Without runway lights, he had no visual reference for landing. The P-61 would hit the ground before Smith realized how low he was flying. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter. The device measured height above ground by bouncing radio waves off the surface, accurate to within 50 feet. Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning navigation. When the altimeter showed 0 feet, he would be on the ground. The technique was dangerous. Any error in navigation meant landing off the runway, hitting trees or coral reefs or construction equipment. Smith's fuel gauge showed 9%, 46 gallons, 8 minutes of flight time, not enough to divert to another airfield. Tacloban on Leyte was the nearest alternative, 90 miles northeast. The P-61 would run out of fuel 40 miles short. Smith had one option: land at McGuire Field without runway lights or crash into the ocean and hope someone rescued him before he drowned. The decision was simple. Smith had survived. 4 intercepts, 5 kills in 55 minutes, the highest single-night total for any American night fighter pilot in the Pacific theater. He had saved American lives on the ground, protected the airfields, enabled the Lingayen Gulf invasion to proceed on schedule. Dying now because of extinguished runway lights would make the entire mission meaningless. Smith turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway was located. His altitude, 600 feet. Fuel, 9%. And the darkness below was absolute. Smith descended to 400 feet. The radar altimeter showed 380 feet above ground level. He reduced airspeed to 120 knots. The P-61's stall speed was 95 knots with flaps fully extended. Flying at 120 knots gave Smith a 25-knot safety margin, not much. But descending slower would consume more fuel. The mathematics were unforgiving. Porter monitored the radar scope. The coastline of Mindoro showed clearly. McGuire Field was inland, approximately 1 mile from the beach. Smith used compass. Heading to navigate. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north. His heading, 180 degrees. If his navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. If not, he would land in jungle or construction areas or coral reefs. At 0058, Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green indicator lights confirmed all 3 wheels were down and locked. Main gear under each engine nacelle. Nose gear forward of the fuselage. The P-61's landing gear was robust, designed to handle rough airfields. But landing without visual references meant Smith couldn't judge his touchdown point. He might hit too hard, collapse the gear. The aircraft would cartwheel. At 120 knots, the crew would not survive. Smith's fuel gauge showed 7%, 36 gallons, 5 minutes remaining. He extended flaps to full. The P-61's airspeed decreased to 110 knots. The aircraft descended at 300 feet per minute. The radar altimeter showed 250 feet, 200, 150. Smith couldn't see the ground, no lights, no visual references, just instruments and the hope that his navigation was correct. At 100 feet altitude, Smith reduced power. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal, but necessary to reach the ground before his fuel ran out, 75 feet, 50 feet, 25 feet. Smith prepared for touchdown. His hands gripped the control column. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, ready to correct for any deviation. The P-61's main wheels hit crushed coral at 0059. The impact was harder than normal. Smith felt the jolt through the airframe, but the landing gear held. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. The P-61 decelerated rapidly, 100 knots, 80, 60, 40. The aircraft slowed to taxi speed at 20 knots. Smith couldn't see where he was on the runway. He kept the brakes applied until the P-61 stopped completely. His fuel gauge showed 6%, 29 gallons, 3 minutes of fuel remaining. Ground crew arrived with flashlights. They guided Smith to the parking area. The P-61's engines shut down at 0103, 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Smith climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were stiff. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. 5 intercepts, 5 kills, 1 blind landing, all in 63 minutes of combat. Porter climbed out from the radar operator's compartment. He had tracked 5 targets successfully, vectored Smith to each intercept, maintained radar contact throughout the engagement. Without Porter's skill, none of the kills would have been possible. Night fighting was a team effort, pilot and radar operator working in perfect coordination. The ground crew inspected the P-61, no damage. All 4 cannons had functioned correctly. Total ammunition expended, 408 rounds. Smith had started the mission with 800 rounds. He landed with 392 rounds remaining, enough ammunition for 2 more intercepts, but 0 fuel for pursuing additional targets. Intelligence officers arrived at 0115. They wanted details, times, locations, altitudes, aircraft types. Smith provided the information from memory: 4 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima Ki-49 Helen bomber, 1 Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter, all destroyed between 23:57 on December 29th and 00:46 on December 30th. Total engagement time, 49 minutes. The intelligence officers confirmed the kills through multiple sources. Ground radar had tracked the intercepts. Coast watchers reported seeing aircraft crash into the ocean. Wreckage was visible at first light: 4 bombers, 1 fighter, all exactly where Smith reported. 5 kills in one night equaled the record for American night fighters. But Smith wasn't finished. On December 30th, 1944, at 14:30 hours, Smith flew his second mission of the day. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted over Mindoro. Single-engine fighters, faster than bombers, more difficult to intercept. Smith and Porter took off in the same P-61. The aircraft had been refueled and rearmed. 800 rounds of 20mm ammunition, 646 gallons of fuel. At 15:12, Porter detected a contact heading north. Altitude, 12,000 feet. Range, 8 miles. Smith climbed to intercept. The target was another Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter, faster than the P-61 in level flight. But Smith had altitude advantage. He dove on the Frank from above. The diving attack increased his speed to 390 mph, faster than the Frank's maximum level speed. Smith fired at 400 yards, 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The Frank's engine exploded, the fighter rolled inverted and dove into the ocean, Smith's 7th kill. The final victory made him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II. 7 confirmed kills, all achieved in less than 24 hours of combat flying. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater would match that total. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations from Mindoro through January 1945. The unit scored 18 total kills during the war, the highest total of any P-61 squadron in the war. Pacific Theater. Smith's 7 kills accounted for 39% of the squadron's total score. Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator. His skill made every intercept possible. The P-61 A Waston continued flying combat missions through May 1945. The aircraft survived the war undamaged. After VJ Day, it was scrapped along with most Black Widows. Only 4 P-61s exist today. None of them is Smith's aircraft. The nose art, the kill markings, the aircraft that hunted 5 aircraft in 80 minutes, all lost to history. McGuire Field supported the Lingayen Gulf invasion as planned. American forces landed on January 9, 1945. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts operating from Mindoro provided air cover. The airfield Smith defended on December 29 enabled that air cover. Engineers estimated that Japanese bombs hitting the construction areas would have delayed airfield completion by 2 weeks. 2 weeks meant the invasion would have been delayed. Casualties would have mounted. The war would have lasted longer. Smith survived the war. He returned to the United States in February 1946, left the military, became a civilian, never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs. The only records of his achievement exist in military archives, unit histories, intelligence reports, the dry documentation of kills confirmed and missions accomplished. The P-61 Black Widow proved what night fighters could achieve. 706 aircraft built, used in every theater, European, Pacific, China, Burma, India, Mediterranean. The aircraft dominated night combat from 1944 through 1945. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated F-61, continued service until 1954, then retired, replaced by jet-powered night fighters with better performance. But in December 1944, over Mindoro, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carroll Smith was the best pilot flying it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who saved lives with radar. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Major Carroll Smith doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.